The Battle of the Little Bighorn, known to Lakota as the Battle of the Greasy Grass, and commonly referred to as Custer's Last Stand, was an armed engagement between combined forces of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes, against the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the United States Army. The battle, which occurred June 25–26, 1876, near the Little Bighorn River in eastern Montana Territory, was the most prominent action of the Great Sioux War of 1876. The fight was an overwhelming victory for the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, led by several major war leaders, including Crazy Horse and Chief Gall, inspired by the visions of Sitting Bull. The U.S. 7th Cavalry, including the Custer Battalion, a force of 700 men led by George Armstrong Custer, suffered a severe defeat. 5 of the 7th Cavalry's 12 companies were annihilated. Custer was killed, as were 2 of his brothers, a nephew, and a brother-in-law. The total U.S. casualty count included 268 dead and 55 severely wounded, including 4 Crow Indian Scouts and 2 Pawnee Indian Scouts. Public response to the Great Sioux War varied at the time. The battle, and Custer's actions in particular, have been studied extensively by historians. Background: tension between the native inhabitants of the Great Plains of the United States and the encroaching white European settlers in the latter half of the 19th century resulted in a series of conflicts known as the Sioux Wars, which took place between 1854 and 1890. Even though many of the native peoples eventually agreed to relocate to ever-shrinking reservations, a number of them resisted, at times fiercely. The 1876 Sunday dance gathering among the Plains tribes, the long-standing tradition known as the Sun Dance, was the most important religious event of the year. It was a time for the annual renewal of life's necessities, for making personal vows, and for seeking visions. It was a holy time, full of continuous prayer. Towards the end of spring in 1876, the Lakota and the Cheyenne held a sun dance attended as well by a number of agency Indians, who had slipped away from their reservations. During a sun dance around June 5, 1876, on Rosebud Creek in Montana, Sitting Bull reportedly had a vision of soldiers falling into his camp like grasshoppers from the sky. At the same time, U.S. military officials were conducting a summer campaign to force the Lakota and the Cheyenne back to their reservations, using infantry and cavalry in a so-called three-pronged approach. The 1876 U.S. military campaign call. John Gibbon's column of 6 companies of the 7th Infantry and 4 companies of the 2nd Cavalry marched east from Fort Ellis in western Montana on March 30, to patrol the Yellowstone River. Brig. Gen. George Crook's column of 10 companies of the 3rd Cavalry, 5 of the 2nd Cavalry, 2 companies of the 4th Infantry, and 3 companies of the 9th Infantry, moved north from Fort Fetterman in the Wyoming Territory on May 29, marching toward the Powder River area. Brig. Gen. Alfred Terry's column, including 12 companies of the 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer's immediate command, companies C and G of the 17th U.S. Infantry, and the Gatling Gun Detachment of the 20th Infantry departed westward from Fort Abraham Lincoln in the Dakota Territory on May 17. They were accompanied by teamsters and packers with 150 wagons and a large contingent of pack mules that reinforced Custer. Companies C, D, and I of the 6th U.S. Infantry moved along the Yellowstone River from Fort Buford on the Missouri River to set up a supply depot and joined Terry on May 29 at the mouth of the Powder River. They were later joined there by the steamboat Far West, which was loaded with 200 tons of supplies from Fort Lincoln. The Battle of the Rosebud. The coordination and planning began to go awry on June 17, 1876, when Crook's column retreated after the Battle of the Rosebud. Surprised and, according to some accounts, astonished by the unusually large numbers of Native Americans, Crook held the field at the end of the battle but felt compelled by his losses to pull back, regroup, and wait for reinforcements. Unaware of Crook's battle, Gibbon and Terry proceeded, joining forces in early June near the mouth of the Rosebud Creek. They reviewed Terry's plan, calling for Custer's regiment to proceed south along the Rosebud while Terry and Gibbon's united forces would move in a westerly direction toward the Bighorn and Little Bighorn rivers. As this was the likely location of native encampments, all Army elements were to converge around June 26 or 27, attempting to engulf the Native Americans. On June 22, Terry ordered the 7th Cavalry, composed of 31 officers and 566 enlisted men under Custer, to begin a reconnaissance in force and pursuit along the Rosebud, with the prerogative to depart from orders if Custer saw sufficient reason. Custer had been offered the use of Gatling guns but declined, believing they would slow his command. Little Bighorn. While the Terry, Gibbon column was marching toward the mouth of the Little Bighorn, on the evening of June 24, Custer's scouts arrived at an overlook known as the Crow's Nest, 14 miles east of the Little Bighorn River. At sunrise on June 25, Custer's scouts reported they could see a massive pony herd and signs of the Native American village roughly 15 miles in the distance. After a night's march, the tired officer who was sent with the scouts could see neither, and when Custer joined them, he was also unable to make the sighting. Custer's scouts also spotted the regimental cooking fires that could be seen from 10 miles away, disclosing the regiment's position. Custer contemplated a surprise attack against the encampment the following morning of June 26. But he then received a report informing him several hostiles had discovered the trail left by his troops. Assuming his presence had been exposed, Custer decided to attack the village without further delay. On the morning of June 25, Custer divided his 12 companies into 3 battalions in anticipation of the forthcoming engagement. 3 companies were placed under the command of Major Marcus Reno, and 3 were placed under the command of Captain Frederick Benteen. 5 companies remained under Custer's immediate command. The 12th Company B under Captain Thomas McDougall had been assigned to escort the slower pack train carrying provisions and additional ammunition. Unknown to Custer, the group of Native Americans seen on his trail were actually leaving the encampment on the Bighorn and did not alert the village. Custer's scouts warned him about the size of the village, with Mitch Bower reportedly saying, "General, I have been with these Indians for 30 years. And this is the largest village I have ever heard of." Custer's overriding concern was that the Native American group would break up and scatter. The command began its approach to the village at noon and prepared to attack in full daylight. Prelude. 7th Cavalry Organization. The 7th Cavalry was created just after the American Civil War. Many men were veterans of the war, including most of the leading officers. A significant portion of the regiment had previously served 4.5 years at F.D. Riley, Kansas, during which time it fought 1 major engagement and numerous skirmishes, experiencing casualties of 36 killed and 27 wounded. 6 other troopers had died of drowning and 51 from cholera epidemics. While stationed in Kansas, the 7th Cavalry had attacked Black Kettle's southern Cheyenne camp on the Washita River in the Battle of Washita River, an attack which was at the time labeled a massacre of innocent Indians by the Indian Bureau. Half of the 7th Cavalry's companies had just returned from 18 months of constabulary duty in the Deep South, having been recalled to Fort Abraham Lincoln to reassemble the regiment for the campaign. About 20% of the troopers had been enlisted in the prior 7 months, were only marginally trained, and had no combat or frontier experience. A sizable number of these recruits were immigrants from Ireland, England and Germany, just as many of the veteran troopers had been before their enlistments. Archaeological evidence suggests that many of these troopers were malnourished and in poor physical condition. Despite being the best equipped and supplied regiment in the Army, Of the 45 officers and 718 troopers then assigned to the 7th Cavalry, 14 officers and 152 troopers did not accompany the 7th during the campaign. The ratio of troops detached for other duty was not unusual for an expedition of this size, and part of the officer shortage was chronic, due to the Army's rigid seniority system. 3 of the regiment's 12 captains were permanently detached, and 2 had never served a day with the 7th since their appointment in July 1866. 3 second lieutenant vacancies were also unfilled. Military assumptions prior to the battle. Number of Indian warriors as the Army moved into the field on its expedition. It was operating with incorrect assumptions as to the number of Indians it would encounter. The Army's assumptions were based on inaccurate information provided by the Indian agents that no more than 800 hostiles were in the area. The Indian agents based the 800 number on the number of Lakota led by Sitting Bull and other leaders off the reservation in protest of U.S. government policies. This was a correct estimate until several weeks before the battle, when the reservation Indians joined Sitting Bull's ranks for the summer buffalo hunt. However, the agents did not take into account the many thousands of reservation Indians who had unofficially left the reservation to join their uncooperative non-reservation cousins led by Sitting Bull. The latter were those groups who had indicated that they were not going to cooperate with the U.S. government and live on reservation lands. Thus, Custer unknowingly faced thousands of Indians, in addition to the 800 non-reservation hostiles. All Army plans were based on the incorrect numbers. While after the battle, Custer was severely criticized for not having accepted reinforcements and for dividing his forces. It must be understood that he had accepted the same official government estimates of hostiles in the area which Terry and Gibbon also accepted. Historian James Donovan states that when Custer asked interpreter Fred Gerard for his opinion on the size of the opposition, he estimated the force at between 1,500 to 2,500 warriors. Additionally, Custer was more concerned with preventing the escape of the Lakota and Cheyenne than with fighting them. From his own observation, as reported by his bugler John Martin, Custer assumed the warriors had been sleeping in on the morning of the battle, to which virtually every native account attested later, giving Custer a false estimate of what he was up against. When he and his scouts first looked down on the village from Crow's Nest across the Little Bighorn River, they could only see the herd of ponies. Looking from a hill 2.5 miles away after parting with Renault's command, Custer could observe only women preparing for the day, and young boys taking thousands of horses out to graze south of the village. Custer's Crow scouts told him it was the largest native village they had ever seen. When the scouts began changing back into their native dress right before the battle, Custer released him from his command. While the village was enormous in size, Custer thought there were far fewer warriors to defend the village. He assumed most of the warriors were still asleep in their teepees. Finally, Custer may have assumed that in the event of his encountering Native Americans, his subordinate Benteen with the pack train would quickly come to his aid. Rifle volleys were a standard way of telling supporting units to come to another unit's aid. In a subsequent official 1879 Army investigation requested by Major Reno, the Reno Board of Inquiry, Benteen and Renault's men testified that they heard distinct rifle volleys as late as 4:30 p.m. during the battle. Custer had wanted to take a day and scout the village before attacking. However, when men went back after supplies dropped by the pack train, they discovered they were being back-trailed by Indians. Reports from his scouts also revealed fresh pony tracks from ridges overlooking his formation. It became apparent that the warriors in the village were either aware of or would soon be aware of his approach. Fearing that the village would break up into small bands that he would have to chase, Custer began to prepare for an immediate attack. The role of Indian non-combatants in Custer's strategy. Lt. Colonel George A. Custer's field strategy was designed to engage non-combatants at the encampments at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, so as to capture women, children, the elderly or disabled to serve as hostages and human shields. Custer's battalions were poised to ride into the camp and secure non-combatant hostages, and force the warriors to surrender. Author Evan S. Connell observed that if Custer could occupy the village before widespread resistance developed, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors would be obliged to surrender, because if they started to fight, they would be shooting their own families. Custer asserted in his book My Life on the Plains, published just 2 years before the Battle of the Little Bighorn, that Indians contemplating a battle, either offensive or defensive, are always anxious to have their women and children removed from all danger. For this reason I decided to locate our military camp as close as convenient to Chief Black Kettle's Cheyenne village, knowing that the close proximity of their women and children, and the necessary exposure in case of conflict, would operate as a powerful argument in favor of peace. When the question of peace or war came to be discussed, on Custer's decision to advance up the bluffs and descend on the village from the east, Lt. Edward Godfrey of Company K surmised, Custer expected to find the squaws and children fleeing to the bluffs on the north, for in no other way do I account for his wide detour. He must have counted upon Renault's success, and fully expected the scatteration of the non-combatants with the pony herds. The probable attack upon the families and capture of the herds were in that event counted upon to strike consternation in the hearts of the warriors, and were elements for success upon which General Custer fully counted. The Sioux and Cheyenne fighters were acutely aware of the danger posed by the military engagement of non-combatants, and that even a semblance of an attack on the women and children would draw the warriors back to the village. According to historian John S. Gray, such was their concern that a feint by Captain Yates and F companies at the mouth of Medicine Tail Coulee caused hundreds of warriors to disengage from the Reno Valley fight and return to deal with the threat to the village. Some authors and historians, based on archaeological evidence and reviews of native testimony, speculate that Custer attempted to cross the river at a point they refer to as Ford D. According to Richard A. Fox, James Donovan, and others, Custer proceeded with a wing of his battalion north and opposite the Cheyenne Circle at that crossing, which provided access to the women and children fugitives. Yates's force posed an immediate threat to fugitive Indian families, gathering at the north end of the huge encampment. Then persisted in his efforts to seize women and children, even as hundreds of warriors were massing around Keogh's wing on the bluffs. Yates' wing, descending to the Little Bighorn River at Ford D, encountered light resistance, undetected by the Indian forces ascending the bluffs east of the village. Custer was almost within striking distance of the refugees before being repulsed by Indian defenders and forced back to Custer Ridge. That hypothesis, by Fox's own admission, is not universally accepted, and is a result of conflicting physical evidence and variations in differing Lakota accounts. Custer's precise movements remain impossible to ascertain.